It's a real pleasure to see you all here this evening, and a particular pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about such an interesting book. Every novel that Trollope wrote is distinctive, but Lady Anna does stand out as something unusual in his oeuvre. And if you agree, it's worth reflecting a little on why that should be. And I'll start by observing that it isn't because its central themes are exceptional. In fact, they're very familiar to anyone who's read more than a few Trollope novels, and I guess that description applies to everyone in this virtual room. So here are what seem to me the central preoccupations of Lady Anna. Marriage, of course. This is one of the many Trollope novels where the plot is driven by the decision of young people, often a young woman, as to the choice of a marriage partner. It's a powerful example of the marriage-related narratives that proliferate in Trollope's body of work and the way in which they can serve as a means of reflecting on the major social or political issues of the day. Trollope's courtship novels are never just about marriage, and this one certainly isn't. And the novel also continues to explore Trollope's persistent interest in the unexpected toughness or strength or obstinacy, call it what you will, of a young woman who has committed herself to a choice of partner and will not be moved, despite the pressure of family and friends to change her mind. Lady Anna is an apparently gentle and malleable, conventional young woman who turns out to be made of tempered steel. You might compare her with Lily Dale, for instance, or Mary Palliser in her immovable determination to marry Frank Tregear in The Duke's Children. In general, young people do finally get their way when they set their faces against their parents in Trollope's fiction. But a young woman who does so is particularly likely to emerge as the winner. And no young woman has a harder time defending her choice than Lady Anna. And closely allied to this is Trollope's repeated portrayal of a woman who cannot change her first allegiance once her heart is given away, even if it would clearly be in her own interest to do so. Mabel Grex would be an example, again from Duke's Children, in her inability to forget Frank Tregear, who finds no difficulty in changing his allegiance, or Julia Brabazon, later Lady Ongar, who cannot move on from Harry Clavering in The Claverings, despite the fact that he's become engaged to Florence Burton, or Laura Kennedy. There are many examples of this recurring motif in Trollope's fiction. And then, of course, there's money. Lady Anna is among those Trollope novels, and there are many, with a consuming interest in money, who has it, who doesn't have it, who wants it, who will or won't inherit it. And the fact that the formal acceptance of Anna's legitimacy means that she becomes heir to a very significant fortune drives the plot of the novel. And it's also a novel deeply interested in social class, rank, the proper or possible relation between the classes, different ranks in society. The wide social difference between the two rivals for Lady Anna's hand is crucial to her plight. Frederick Lovell is an earl, every inch a gentleman, and Daniel Thwaite, as every character in the novel is acutely aware, is a working tailor. And this is an extreme example of a tension common in Trollope's romance plots, where social class often interacts with courtship in tense and uncomfortable ways. How much does class or rank count in measuring human worth? Should it count in the way that it does? Trollope returns to this troubling question in novel after novel and never arrives at a conclusive answer. And Lady Anna is not the novel that settles the matter. Trollope's enduring interest in the law is another prominent theme in the novel. The legal underpinnings of Lady Anna's situation and that of her mother are repeatedly rehearsed, and the trial that might, in a different novel, have been the climax of the story is, in fact, here treated as an absorbing anticlimax with a manipulated verdict. It's one of the many examples of novels by Trollope where lawyers, their conversations, their arguments, their motives are important and treated with searching analysis. Sir William Paterson, the Solicitor General who acts for the interests of the Earl's family, is an interesting example. Like Frederick Lovell, he's a thoroughgoing gentleman, and he's often seen to be right in his assessments of a dauntingly tangled situation. But he is a worldly man and disconcertingly cavalier in his interpretations of legal process. Trollope treats him with respect, but Sir William represents some of his long-standing suspicions about the operations of the law. He emerges well from the novel's ethical morass, largely because he isn't, as his colleagues point out, he isn't entirely a lawyer. Mental illness. Mental illness is another driving force in this narrative. Josephine Murray, later Lady Lovell, Anna's mother, has some claim to be the novel's central character. Some critics have identified her as such. In marrying for money and rank rather than for love, and then coming spectacularly to grief because she has married an unworthy man, she's yet an example of yet another of Trollope's repeating fictional patterns. We've seen that situation before in Trollope's fiction. But in her subsequent relentless obsession with the restoration of her rightful place in society, which then morphs into her utterly unbending determination that Anna should renounce her engagement to Daniel Thwaite in order to marry the gracious young Earl, she reflects Trollope's exploration of the ways in which brooding over decades of perceived wrong can unhinge a mind. And no doubt memories of his father's decline had some part to play in this enduring theme in Trollope's writing. The gradual disintegration of Lady Lovell, as little by little she loses her grip on reality, wishing for the death of her daughter rather than marriage to Daniel Thwaite, and then, of course, attempting to murder Daniel. That's among the most powerful concerns of the book. And here again, parallels immediately suggest themselves. Josiah Crawley's hovering on the brink of insanity in The Last Chronicle of Barset, or Louis Trevelyan's deranged jealousy in He Knew He Was Right. And in spite of Trollope's deep dislike of sensationalism, this is not the only novel to feature murder or attempted murder. In fact, crops up quite often in Trollope's fiction. And there is a memorable murderous mother in An Eye for an Eye, one of Trollope's Irish novels. And Robert Kennedy tries to shoot Phineas Finn in Phineas Finn. And in fact, physical violence as an expression or culmination of growing instability is another repeated pattern in Trollope's fiction. and Lady Anna provides a compelling example. And the final point I'd make in this lengthening list of the themes of this novel is its concern with politics. It's not a political novel in the sense that the Palliser novels are political. There's no treatment of elections, parliamentary concerns, political manoeuvrings, matters of government, but it does reflect on that recalcitrant and fundamental question in Trollope's fiction. How should the relation between inherited privilege and advantage and those who do not enjoy those blessings be defined? Not just in the context of courtship and family conflict, but in a broader social context. Should the differences be broken down, or do they represent something substantial, something that acts to the advantage of society as a whole? Daniel Thwaites' radicalism is defined in stark contrast to the immovable conservatism of those like the rector, who consider him to be by definition unworthy to marry Anna as a tailor. The Lovell family's view of Daniel doesn't get much further than the recalcitrant fact that he is a tailor, but the reader is asked to understand that Daniel's political identity, his radicalism, is also a defining characteristic of his disposition. And in this respect, Daniel's politics are seen to be as significant as his social class in this conflicted narrative. So I've touched on a long list of themes in Lady Anna that can be identified as recurrent preoccupations in Trollope's fiction. So what is it, then, that makes me say this novel is an exception in his oeuvre? To put it simply, it's because it is not simply a novel about an obsession, though it is also an obsessive novel. Unlike most of Trollope's books, it doesn't really have any subplots. And though there are brief flashes of humour, by and large, it really doesn't demonstrate Trollope's characteristic leaning to social comedy. Some have termed it a tragedy. I wouldn't want to take that position, though the story of Josephine Murray is largely tragic. The novel ends with a relatively harmonious wedding, and nobody, not even the unhinged Josephine, nobody comes entirely to grief. But this is a sombre novel, and it's hard to see the conclusion as a completely happy one. It is, again, characteristic of Trollope to construct his novels from deep-rooted arguments with himself, as he struggled with his sometimes incompatible impulses towards social conservatism on the one hand, and a recognition of the need for change on the other. It's a tension that Trollope was never wholly able to resolve, but in Lady Anna it is, to an unusual extent, unresolved. No choice open to the unfortunate Anna can be identified as really satisfactory. In his autobiography, Trollope makes it clear that she must marry Daniel. She owes him her loyalty and gratitude after those long years in which only he and his father, Thomas, whose fate in the novel is among its many very uncomfortable features, Daniel and Thomas were the only supporters to stand up for her and her outcast mother. and she has irrevocably given him her heart. Trollope makes his own position clear. I quote, "A fine, young, noble lover is provided for her, and all the charms of sweet living with nice people are thrown in her way in order that she may be made to give up the tailor. And the charms are very powerful with her. But the feeling that she is bound by her troth to the man who had always been true to her overcomes everything, and she marries the tailor. It was my wish, of course, to justify her in doing so." When readers disagreed, and many did, at the time and since, Trollope was indignant. He wrote to Lady Wood, who objected to the novel's conclusion. I quote, "Of course the girl has to marry the tailor. It is very dreadful, but there was no other way. The story was originated in my mind by an idea I had as to the doubt which would or might exist in a girl's mind as to whether she ought to be true to her troth or true to her lineage, when, from early circumstances, the one had been given in a manner detrimental to the other, and I determined that in such a case she ought to be true all through. To make the discrepancy as great as possible, I made the girl an earl's daughter and the betrothed a tailor. All the horrors had to be invented to bring about a condition in which an earl's daughter could become become engaged to a tailor without glaring fault on her side." In a half-joking letter to his friend Mary Holmes, he's even more vehement. I quote again, "You've trod on ever so many of my favourite corns. Lady Anna is the best novel I ever wrote. Very much. Quite far away above all the others. A lady ought to marry a tailor if she chanced to fall in love with such a creature and to promise him and take his goodness when she was not a bad lady. That is all. Will you deny it?" Well, whether Trollope really thought Lady Anna was his best novel is doubtful. A few readers would now agree, though it is a novel that sticks in the mind. But he certainly thought it was a novel that should be seen to vindicate Anna's choice to reject the elegant and likeable Frederick Lovell in favour of the somewhat charmless Daniel. And yet, it's not just that Daniel is deliberately described in direct contrast to the cultivated sweetness of the graceful Frederick, though he is, and Trollope makes that clear. I quote, "Daniel Thwaite was a dark brown man with no tinge of ruddiness about him, a thin, spare man, almost swarthy, whose hands were as brown as a nut and whose cheeks and forehead were brown." But it's not only that readers are asked to see Daniel as physically unprepossessing. More problematic is that he is something of a bully. I quote again, "He was ambitious, discontented, sullen, and tyrannical. He hated the domination of others, but was prone to domineer himself. He suspected evil of all above him in rank, and the millennium to which he looked forward was to be produced by the gradual elimination of all social distinctions. He hardly sounds like an easy husband. And Trollope emphasises that he tyrannizes over Anna. She loves him, but she is also afraid of him. One telling reason for her rejection of Frederick is that she is terrified of the caustic tongue lashing she would get from Daniel if she were to dare to try to undo her bargain. And Trollope makes it clear that Daniel will continue to insist on his power over Anna after the marriage. He firmly rejects the lawyer's suggestion that Anna should have any control over the money she brings to the marriage after the wedding. I'll have nothing to do with such a settlement. When she is my wife, her property shall be my property. I don't want my wife to have anything of her own before marriage, but she certainly shall have nothing after marriage, independently of me. Rather chilling, that, and Trollope does not approve of Daniel's despotism, and his ironical comment at this point of the novel is telling. For a man with sound views of domestic power and marital rights always choose a radical. Daniel's egalitarianism only goes so far. Frederick's kindness and polish is very much more attractive, and his feeling for Anna is seen to be genuine. And yet, as Anna knows very well, Frederick is courting her primarily because of the money he needs to maintain his social position. He is appalled when she confesses that she is engaged to Daniel Thwaite, a tailor, and feels that she is contaminated by the connection. But he nevertheless renews his suit. She's worth less in his eyes because of her early attachment to a working man, but the money is not worth less, and money has always been the real point of his wooing. Anna knows this very well, and he falls in her estimation as he persists in trying to win her hand. She had been dazzled and had thought him something close to a god, but she learned, I quote, to think that his motives were merely human and perhaps sordid. He ought to have abstained after she had owned her own degradation. Now, Trollope makes sure that we don't see Frederick as a self-interested monster. He wants to do the right thing, and he does his best to treat Anna with courtesy and respect. And he is, as Trollope keeps reminding us, fragrantly beautiful. But he doesn't have the strength and substance that we see in Daniel, for all Daniel's many faults. Frederick does no work, always a very bad sign in Trollope's presentation of a man's character. He's curled and pampered and used to luxury. And then there is that unfortunate dressing gown that he wears to receive Daniel when they meet towards the end of the novel. And you'll remember the scene. He's not out of his bedroom when Daniel calls after 9 in the morning, another bad sign. And when he does emerge, he's not dressed for the day. He's decided to renounce Anna and he's willing to take Daniel's hand. He did take him by the hand as he entered the sitting room, radiant from his bath, clad in a short, bright-coloured dressing gown, such as young men then wore o' mornings, with embroidered slippers on his feet and a smile on his face. This is not the kind of thing that Trollope altogether approves of. And the hard-working Daniel certainly doesn't approve of it. Daniel remembers that dressing gown later. He is, after all, a tailor, interested in clothes, talking about his meeting with Lord Lovell to Anna. He will not trouble me at all, but as he is your cousin, I would fain that he could be a man. He had a sort of gown on, which would have made a grand frock for you, sweetheart, only too smart, I fear, for my wife. She laughed and was pleased, and remembered without a shade either of regret or remorse the manner in which the popinjay had helped her over the stepping stones at Bolton Abbey. There's always an understated sense of gender ambiguity about the young Earl, who, for all the authority of his social position, has a partly feminine presence. This is part of his appeal. But Trollope suggests that it also reflects Frederick's distance from the hard world of masculine work that is always so important to his code of values. Anna looks back. When that young man had caught her from stone to stone as she passed over the ford at Bolton, she was almost ready to give herself to him. But then had come upon her that sense of sickness, the faint overdone flavour of sugared sweetness, which arises when sweet things become too luscious to the eater. She had struggled to be honest and strong, and had just not fallen into the pot of treacle. Frederick's life, which is not, of course, the life of the landed gentry, but of the aristocracy, is finally seen to be decadent. Its capacity for corruption is amply demonstrated in the ruin that the former Earl, Lady Anna's father, brings on his family, indeed anyone who comes into contact with him, through his utter self-indulgence and entire lack of moral principle. His worthlessness reflects the uncertain claim that the aristocracy could make for respect and deference. Daniel's rigid politics are not attractive, but they are not seen to be entirely without justification. None of this makes Anna's oppressive experiences throughout the novel any easier. As an alternative title for this book, Poor Anna would be very accurate. She's everyone's target and is given very little space to develop her own identity and presence. Trollope himself doesn't give her a great deal of room to grow, given that her main narrative function is to be seen to suffer helplessly as others try to use her for their own purposes. Nevertheless, Trollope's increasing sense of the difficulties and injustices inherent in the situation of young women and of women who are not so young within the apparently settled proprieties of Victorian society are very marked in this novel. He doesn't rescue Anna, but he is on her side. Pushed from pillar to post, blamed and threatened when she isn't being courted for self-interested reasons, she is, for the most part, a pitiable figure, though she also turns out to be formidable in her refusal to renounce her own will. This is a novel that bears down on its central characters with unrelenting pressure, and they are, for the most part, isolated to an extent that is unusual in Trollope's fiction. Daniel is not part of a community, nor are Anna and her mother. Only the Lovell family are seen to have a collective sense of purpose, though they too are divided in what should be done to extricate the Earl from his financial difficulties. The novel's located within a context of social fragmentation, and this is one of the features that gives it an oppressive feel, with a sense of social distress that never quite leaves it, despite the more or less conciliatory arrangements that lead to its conclusion. Why does Lady Anna have this relentless, almost claustrophobic feel? Some of the reasons are biographical. The novel was written in 1871, though it wasn't published until 1874, and that was a point of challenge and change in Trollope's life. His options were beginning to close in as he aged. He'd made the difficult decision to part with his much-loved country house at Waltham Cross for the dispiriting reason that he could no longer afford it, having given up his post office income and the editorship of St. Paul's. He'd moved to London, where life would be cheaper. But he was uneasy about the kind of money-driven city that London had become, and this is a disquiet that shadows Lady Anna. Another reason, I think, is to be found in the circumstances of the novel's composition. The whole book was written remarkably during the voyage from Liverpool to Melbourne, as Trollope and his wife travelled to Australia in Brunel's SS Great Britain to visit their son Fred, who was a farmer in New South Wales, on a sheep station 250 miles west of Sydney. So the Great Britain, some of you may have visited it. It is now a major tourist attraction in Bristol, but in 1871 it was very much a working vessel, carrying 360 passengers in first and second class cabins, with more packed together in steerage. There can't have been a great deal of room. Trollope had a desk installed in his cabin, and he wrote at a steady rate over the months that he was at sea, from May to July, 66 pages of manuscript in every week, every page of manuscript containing 250 words. And those among you who are writers, I mean, you just read that kind of thing. I don't know how he did it, but anyway, he did do it. He'd always had an exceptionally disciplined approach to his profession, as you'll know, but this was something a little different. Day after day in a cramped cabin, week after week in the crowded confines of a ship. He was not at home. He was on his way to visit a son who'd chosen a new way of life in a new country. These were conditions that gave rise to a novel with a new and broadly pessimistic perspective on the condition of England, scepticism that was to find a more expansive expression in The Way We Live Now, the novel he wrote on his return to England. And it's not an accident that Anna and Daniel find an escape from their social difficulties by taking themselves off to New South Wales, where Trollope's son had made his home. But Trollope, who was always reluctant to close the door to optimism and to change, does not do so in Lady Anna. The shrewd and accommodating Sir William Paterson, who has proved himself to be among the most far-sighted of the novel's central characters, predicts that the young couple will not live in permanent exile from England. He says, in 5 years he'll be in Parliament, as likely as not. In 10 years he'll be Sir Daniel Thwaite, if he cares for it. And in 15 years, Lady Anna will be supposed by everybody to have made a very happy marriage. Frederick, with his ever-flexible code of values, resolves the difficulty in inviting a tailor as a guest among the refined society of his uncle's rectory by declaring that the social difference that he had at first perceived to be impossibly offensive might, after all, be simply erased. You'll find he'll make a very good sort of gentleman, he says. But Daniel has now been endowed with a very healthy income, and that makes all the difference. Trollope himself tells his readers that he does not consider his story to be entirely concluded. The final sentence of the novel is open-ended. Of the further doings of Mr. Daniel Thwaite and his wife, Lady Anna, of how they travelled and saw many things, and how he became, perhaps, a wiser man, the present writer may, he hopes, lives to tell. This is by no means a comfortable novel, and the unhappy plight of Lady Anna, extended over so many chapters, is what chiefly lingers in the mind. But it is not without hope. There is, as always in Trollope's imagination, room for change, though there will be some, like Josephine Murray or the rector, who will not bring themselves to participate. Thank you.